Maya Richardson stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 5:30 in the morning, smoothing down the collar of her navy blue blazer for the third time, her hands trembling slightly as she rehearsed the words she would say to the banker at First Continental Bank later that day. The mirror reflected back a woman of 32 years with determined brown eyes that had seen struggle but refused to accept defeat. Hair pulled back into a professional bun that took her 20 minutes to perfect, and a face that carried both the exhaustion of raising an 8-year-old daughter alone and the fierce hope that today would change everything. She had been preparing for this meeting for 6 months, ever since the idea of opening her own restaurant and community center had transformed from a whispered dream into a fully realized business plan that sat in a leather portfolio on her kitchen table, its pages filled with financial projections, market research, letters of support from community leaders, and photographs of the perfect location on Auburn Avenue, where her grandmother used to take her for Sunday dinners after church services. At the Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, Maya could still taste her grandmother's peach cobbler, that perfect balance of cinnamon and brown sugar that made people close their eyes and sigh with contentment. And it was that memory that fueled her determination to create a place where other families could build their own traditions over fried chicken and collard greens and sweet potato pie, where children could do homework in corner booths while their parents worked late shifts, where the neighborhood could gather and feel like they belonged to something bigger than themselves. The apartment around her was small but immaculate, every surface scrubbed clean, every dish put away, every piece of second-hand furniture arranged to maximize the limited space in the 2-bedroom unit she shared with her daughter Jasmine in the Mechanicsville neighborhood of Atlanta. Maya had grown up in similar apartments, watching her father Marcus leave for double shifts at the Ford assembly plant in Hapeville, while her mother Diane worked as a nursing assistant at Piedmont General Hospital, both of them pouring every ounce of energy into providing a stable life for their children, despite the invisible barriers that seemed to rise up whenever they tried to move forward. Her father had once applied for a promotion to floor supervisor, a position he had earned through 15 years of perfect attendance and innovative suggestions that saved the company thousands of dollars. But the promotion went to a younger white man with half the experience and a fraternity connection to someone in management, and Maya remembered the way her father's shoulders slumped when he came home that evening, the way he sat at the kitchen table without speaking, the way her mother rubbed his back and whispered that God had other plans. That memory lived in Maya's bones now, a reminder of what happened when you let other people's limitations define your possibilities. And she had promised herself that her daughter would grow up watching her mother fight for her dreams, rather than accept whatever scraps fell from someone else's table. The business plan represented 3 years of work, 3 years of running a modest catering business from her home kitchen while taking online courses in hospitality management and restaurant operations, 3 years of saving every extra dollar while other single mothers her age were buying new cars or taking vacations to Miami Beach or Charleston. Maya's vacation was visiting the library every Saturday to study successful restaurant models, to understand profit margins and inventory management and the psychology of menu pricing, to transform herself from a woman who could cook incredible food into a woman who could run a sustainable business that would employ 15 people and serve 300 customers daily, and become the heartbeat of a neighborhood that desperately needed gathering places where hope felt possible. She had letters of support from Reverend Jonathan Williams at Greater Mount Zion, from City Councilwoman Patricia Henderson, who represented their district, from the president of the Auburn Avenue Business Association, who had watched Maya's catering business grow from serving 20 people at church functions to catering corporate events for companies like Southeastern Marketing Solutions and Heritage Financial Group. Her credit score was 720, not perfect but solid, built carefully through years of paying every bill on time, even when it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner and wearing shoes with worn-out soles until the leather split. She had $12,000 in savings, every penny documented and tracked, and she needed a loan of $85,000 to lease the space, purchase equipment, hire staff, and maintain operating capital for the first 6 months while the restaurant established itself. Maya kissed her sleeping daughter's forehead before leaving the apartment, pausing to adjust the purple comforter that Jasmine had kicked off during the night, studying the peaceful face of the person who made every sacrifice worthwhile. Jasmine was brilliant and curious and kind, the type of child who brought home stray cats and shared her lunch with classmates who forgot theirs and asked questions that made adults stop and think about why the world worked the way it did. Just last week, Jasmine had asked why all the people in the bank commercials were white when their neighborhood was mostly black, and Maya had struggled to find an answer that was honest without being crushing, settling finally on telling her daughter that the world was changing and that they were part of that change, that every time someone like them walked into spaces where they weren't expected, they made it easier for the next person. Now Maya was about to walk into First Continental Bank on Peachtree Street, into that gleaming tower of glass and marble where she had never seen another face that looked like hers in any position of authority. And she was going to ask them to believe in her vision, even though every statistic she had read suggested they would find reasons to say no. The drive downtown took 40 minutes through morning traffic, past the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, where the Falcons played, and the Georgia Aquarium, where she had taken Jasmine for her 7th birthday, and the World of Coca-Cola, where tourists lined up to taste sodas from around the world. Maya parked in the visitor lot and sat in her 12-year-old Honda Civic for 10 minutes, breathing deeply and reviewing her presentation one final time, running through potential questions and her carefully prepared answers. She had practiced with Eleanor Washington, her mentor, and the only black woman she knew who had successfully built a business empire in Atlanta, starting with a single beauty salon in the 1970s, and eventually owning a chain of 15 salons across the Southeast before retiring at 75. Eleanor had sat across from Maya in her elegant Buckhead home last week, firing questions with the rapid intensity of someone who had survived every obstacle the business world could throw at a black woman, pushing Maya to defend every assumption and justify every projection until Maya's voice grew hoarse and her confidence solidified into something unshakable. Eleanor had looked at her finally with those sharp eyes that missed nothing and said that Maya was ready, that the plan was sound, that the only question was whether the banker would have the wisdom to recognize an opportunity when it sat across from him. The lobby of First Continental Bank was everything Maya had expected, all soaring ceilings and expensive abstract art and leather furniture arranged in conversation clusters where important people discussed important matters in hushed tones. The receptionist was a young white woman with perfect teeth and a practiced smile, who directed Maya to the elevators and told her that Mr. James Whitmore was expecting her on the 14th floor in the commercial lending department. Maya rode the elevator alone, watching the numbers climb and feeling her heartbeat accelerate, reminding herself that she belonged here as much as anyone, that her money was as green as anyone else's, that her dream was as valid as the dreams of all the other entrepreneurs who had sat in these offices and asked for the capital to build something meaningful. The elevator doors opened to reveal another reception area, this one decorated with photographs of Atlanta landmarks and framed certificates proclaiming First Continental's commitment to community development and small business support, words that sounded beautiful but meant nothing if they didn't translate into actual loans for actual people who needed actual opportunities. James Whitmore emerged from a corner office precisely at 10 o'clock, and Maya's first impression was of a man who had probably been handsome in his youth, but had settled into the comfortable complacency of middle age, his waistline expanding along with his sense of entitlement, his handshake firm, but his eyes already assessing and categorizing her in ways that made Maya's spine stiffen. He was maybe 50 years old, with graying hair and an expensive suit and a University of Georgia class ring that caught the light as he gestured for her to follow him into his office. The office was large and impersonal, decorated with golf trophies and family photographs showing a wife and 2 teenage children on a sailboat, and framed diplomas from institutions Maya recognized as exclusive and expensive. Whitmore settled into his leather chair behind a massive oak desk, while Maya sat across from him in a smaller chair that seemed designed to make visitors feel diminished, and she fought the urge to adjust her position as she pulled out her business plan and placed it on the desk between them. The first 20 minutes went better than Maya had dared to hope, with Whitmore nodding appreciatively as she walked through her market research and financial projections, asking intelligent questions about her supply chain and staffing strategy, commenting favorably on the letters of support and her catering business's track record. Maya began to relax slightly, allowing herself to believe that maybe Eleanor had been right, that maybe this man would see past whatever assumptions he carried and recognize the solid business opportunity she was presenting. She talked about her vision for the community center portion of the restaurant, the after-school tutoring program, and the small business workshops, and the Sunday gospel brunches that would bring together generations of neighbors who needed spaces to connect and support each other. Whitmore smiled and made notes and said the words that every entrepreneur wants to hear. Phrases like innovative concept and strong community ties and impressive preparation, and Maya felt hope rising in her chest like the sun breaking through clouds after a long storm. Then Whitmore pulled her credit report and bank statements from the folder she had provided, and Maya watched his expression shift in ways too subtle for most people to notice, but unmistakable to someone who had spent a lifetime learning to read white faces for signs of danger or dismissal. His smile became tighter, more professional and less genuine, and his questions became more pointed, focusing on gaps and risks rather than opportunities and strengths. He asked why she didn't have more cash reserves, and when she explained that she had been building her business while supporting a daughter as a single mother, his nod seemed to carry judgment rather than understanding. He questioned whether Auburn Avenue was really the right location, suggesting that perhaps she should consider areas with more foot traffic. And when Maya pointed out that Auburn Avenue was the historic center of black business and culture in Atlanta, that it was where she had roots and relationships and community trust, he made a note that seemed to dismiss rather than record her reasoning. The rejection, when it came, was wrapped in language designed to sound reasonable and professional rather than prejudiced and cruel. Whitmore leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, and told Maya that while he appreciated her enthusiasm and her obvious talent in the kitchen, the bank had certain standards and requirements that had to be met for commercial loans of this size, and unfortunately, her credit history just didn't demonstrate the kind of financial stability they needed to see. Maya felt her heart drop, but kept her face neutral, asking what specific concerns he had about her credit, since her score was 720, and she had never missed a payment on anything. Whitmore waved his hand dismissively and talked about depth of credit history and debt-to-income ratios and the high failure rate of restaurants in general and the particular challenges of the Auburn Avenue market, all the while avoiding direct eye contact, his words painting her dream as naive and unrealistic rather than carefully researched and thoroughly planned. Maya tried to address each objection systematically, pulling out additional documentation and offering to provide whatever supplementary information the bank required. But she could see that Whitmore had already made his decision, that everything he was saying now was just justification for a conclusion he had reached the moment he saw her credit report and realized exactly who was sitting across from his desk asking for $85,000. He suggested that perhaps she should try a smaller institution, maybe one of those community development credit unions that specialized in higher risk loans. And the way he said higher risk made clear that he wasn't talking about her business model, but about her as a person, about the color of her skin and the neighborhood she came from and the kind of people he assumed couldn't manage money or build sustainable businesses. Maya felt rage building in her chest, but forced it down, maintaining her professional composure, even as Whitmore stood and extended his hand and told her that he wished her the best of luck and that she should definitely keep pursuing her dreams, just perhaps on a smaller scale to start, maybe a food truck or a catering business, as if she hadn't already built a successful catering business, as if he had listened to nothing she said. She shook his hand and thanked him for his time, and gathered her materials with hands that wanted to shake but refused to give him the satisfaction. And she walked out of that office with her head high and her eyes dry because she would be damned if she would let James Whitmore see her cry. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up, and Maya stared at her reflection in the polished doors and saw her grandmother's face superimposed over her own, that strong, beautiful woman who had survived Jim Crow and raised 6 children while cleaning white people's houses, and never once accepted that her dreams were less valid than anyone else's dreams. Her grandmother had told her stories about applying for jobs and being turned away, about saving money in coffee cans because banks wouldn't open accounts for black women, about building success through sheer determination and mutual support when every institution was designed to keep people like them poor and powerless. Maya had listened to those stories as a child and felt grateful that she lived in different times, that the world had changed and opportunities existed that her grandmother never had. But standing in that elevator, she realized how naive she had been, how the discrimination had simply become more subtle and sophisticated, hiding behind credit scores and lending criteria and professional language that sounded neutral but functioned exactly the same as the old signs that said whites only. She made it to her car before the tears came, sitting in the driver's seat of her Honda Civic in the underground parking garage while sobs shook her body, and all the hope she had carried into that building drained away like water through her fingers. Maya had prepared for rejection on business grounds, had backup plans and alternative strategies, but she hadn't prepared for the soul-crushing realization that no amount of preparation would ever be enough when the person across the desk had already decided what she was capable of, based on factors that had nothing to do with her qualifications or her character. She thought about her daughter waiting at home, excited to hear about the meeting, asking whether they would be able to afford dance classes now or maybe a trip to Disney World, and Maya didn't know how to explain to an 8-year-old that the world still worked this way, that being smart and hard-working and prepared wasn't always enough when other people controlled the gates, and the gates were designed to stay closed to people who looked like them. Her phone rang, and Jasmine's voice filled the car, bright and hopeful, and completely convinced that her mother could accomplish anything she set her mind to, asking how the meeting went and whether the banker was nice and when they could start fixing up the restaurant. Maya swallowed her tears and forced cheerfulness into her voice and told her daughter that the meeting went fine, but that they needed to explore some other options, that sometimes the first door you knock on isn't the right door, but that just means you keep knocking until you find the one that opens. Jasmine accepted this with the easy resilience of childhood and started talking about her day at school and the art project she was working on and the new friends she made at recess. And Maya listened and responded and felt her purpose crystallizing into something harder and more determined than hope. She would not let James Whitmore and his assumptions define what was possible for her or for her daughter, would not accept that their dreams were worth less than anyone else's dreams, would not go quietly back to her small apartment and her small life and tell herself that maybe she should be grateful for what she had instead of reaching for what she deserved. Maya drove home slowly through afternoon traffic, her mind already moving past the rejection and toward whatever came next, knowing that Eleanor Washington would have wisdom, and that the community would have support, and that somewhere out there was a path forward even if she couldn't see it yet. She'd spent her whole life watching people like her accept limitations and diminished expectations, had watched her father's shoulders slump, and her mother's dreams deferred, and her neighbors' talents wasted because the systems were designed to keep certain people in certain places. But Maya had also watched her grandmother build something from nothing, and Eleanor Washington turn a single beauty salon into an empire, and countless other black women create success despite every obstacle. And she carried their strength in her DNA along with their scars. The rejection from First Continental Bank hurt in ways that would take time to process, but somewhere beneath the hurt was anger, and beneath the anger was determination, and beneath the determination was the unshakable conviction that James Whitmore had made a mistake today, that he would live to regret, though she had no idea yet what form that regret would take or how long the journey would be before she could look back at this moment and see it as the beginning rather than the end. Maya sat across from Eleanor Washington 3 days after the rejection, in the sunroom of Eleanor's Buckhead home, where afternoon light filtered through lace curtains and fell across antique furniture that had witnessed decades of struggle and triumph. Eleanor poured sweet tea into crystal glasses that had belonged to her mother, each movement deliberate and graceful despite arthritis that had gnarled her fingers into permanent curves, and she studied Maya's face with eyes that had seen every possible variation of defeat and recognized which ones could be transformed into fuel for something greater. The older woman had built her empire salon by salon through the 1970s and 80s, when black women were expected to be grateful for jobs cleaning other people's hair, rather than owning the buildings where those jobs happened. And she had faced rejection from every bank in Atlanta before finding a Jewish businessman who remembered his own grandfather's stories of discrimination and took a chance on a black woman with more determination than capital. Eleanor's success had made her a legend in Atlanta's black business community, someone whose advice was sought by everyone, from struggling entrepreneurs to city council members. And Maya had been meeting with her monthly for 2 years now, learning not just business strategy, but the deeper lessons about how to survive in a world designed to crush people like them. Eleanor listened without interrupting, while Maya recounted every detail of the meeting with James Whitmore, how his demeanor had shifted when he reviewed her credit report, how his questions had changed from supportive to skeptical, how the rejection had been wrapped in professional language that couldn't quite hide the underlying assumptions about who deserved access to capital and who should be grateful for whatever scraps they could find. When Maya finished talking, her voice hoarse with emotion and her eyes red from crying that had continued sporadically over the past 72 hours, Eleanor set down her glass and leaned forward with an intensity that made the younger woman straighten in her chair. The older woman asked a single question that cut through all of Maya's self-doubt and anger and confusion, asking what Maya was going to do with this rejection, whether she would let it define her or whether she would use it to fuel something that James Whitmore couldn't even imagine in his comfortable corner office, with his golf trophies and his assumptions about who belonged in the world of finance and commerce. Eleanor's voice was firm, but not harsh, challenging but not dismissive, and Maya realized that this was a test as important as any bank meeting, a moment where she would choose between accepting the limitations others tried to impose or fighting for the vision that burned in her chest like righteous fire. Eleanor told stories then, pouring out memories like the sweet tea that sat between them, stories about her own rejections and humiliations, and moments when giving up seemed like the only reasonable option. She talked about the banker in 1973 who had laughed when she proposed opening a beauty salon, who had told her that black women didn't have enough money to support a business that charged real prices rather than kitchen prices, who had suggested she stick to doing hair in her basement like all the other women in her neighborhood. Eleanor described the rage she had felt walking out of that bank, the way she had wanted to scream and break things and prove to every white person in Atlanta that they were wrong about her and wrong about her people. But instead, she had gone home and started making phone calls and building networks and finding the people who believed in possibility rather than limitation. She had worked 3 jobs while saving money and learning the business and building relationships with suppliers who would give her credit when banks wouldn't. And she had opened her first salon with borrowed equipment and second-hand chairs and a determination that scared away doubt like light scattering shadows. The salon had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations except her own, and within 5 years she had opened 3 more locations, and within 15 years she had built an empire that employed 200 people and served thousands of customers weekly across the Southeast. But Eleanor's most important lesson came at the end of her stories, when she looked at Maya with those fierce eyes and said that revenge wasn't about proving James Whitmore wrong. It was about building something so undeniable that his opinion became irrelevant, that his limitations became his problem rather than Maya's barrier. She talked about how anger could be poison or fuel, depending on how you channeled it, how the best response to discrimination wasn't confrontation but construction, building success that spoke louder than any argument or protest or appeal to conscience. Eleanor opened a drawer in her antique secretary desk and pulled out books with worn covers and dog-eared pages, books about finance and investment and banking, telling Maya that if she wanted to beat people like James Whitmore, she needed to understand their game better than they did, needed to learn the language of capital and leverage and return on investment until she could speak it fluently enough to make them listen despite their prejudices. The older woman explained that the world of money had rules that seemed complex, but were actually simple once you understood them, and those rules didn't care about the color of your skin or the neighborhood you came from. They only cared about whether you could make numbers grow and manage risk and deliver returns to people who trusted you with their capital. Maya left Eleanor's house that evening with an armful of books and a fire in her belly that felt different from the anger that had consumed her in the parking garage 3 days earlier, cleaner and more focused and directed toward building rather than destroying. She drove to Community First Credit Union on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, a modest building that had been serving black families and businesses in Atlanta since 1968. And she met with the loan officer there, who was a black woman named Sandra Mitchell, who had grown up in the same neighborhood as Maya's mother and who listened to the business plan with genuine interest rather than skeptical dismissal. Sandra asked tough questions about cash flow and contingency planning and what Maya would do if revenues were 20% below projections in the first 6 months. But her questions came from a place of wanting to help Maya succeed, rather than finding reasons to reject her application. The credit union could only offer $40,000 rather than the $85,000 Maya needed, but Sandra suggested ways to reduce startup costs and phase the build-out and start smaller with plans to expand once the restaurant proved itself. And for the first time since the meeting with James Whitmore, Maya felt like someone in the financial world saw her as a legitimate business person rather than a risk to be managed or a problem to be avoided. 3 months later, Maya signed the lease on a modest storefront on Auburn Avenue, a space that had once housed a record store in the 1960s, and then a clothing boutique in the 80s, and then sat vacant for 3 years until she walked through its doors and saw not what it was, but what it could become. The space was smaller than she had originally envisioned, with room for only 30 seats instead of 50, and a kitchen that would require creative organization to function efficiently. But it was hers in a way that made her chest tight with pride and terror. She used the $40,000 from Community First Credit Union, along with her $12,000 in savings and another $8,000 borrowed from Eleanor and $6,000 raised through a fundraiser organized by Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, and she threw herself into the renovation work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Maya was at the space every day from 6 in the morning until midnight, painting walls and refinishing the old hardwood floors and installing equipment purchased second-hand from restaurants that had closed. Her hands blistered and her back aching, but her spirit soaring, because this was hers, built with her own sweat and the support of people who believed in her rather than the conditional approval of people like James Whitmore, who thought they were gatekeepers to opportunity. Jasmine came to the space after school most days, doing homework at what would become the hostess station while her mother worked, occasionally helping paint baseboards or arrange chairs or taste test recipes that Maya was developing for the menu. The restaurant became a family project in ways that Maya hadn't anticipated, with her father Marcus coming by on weekends to help with the heavier construction work, and her mother Diane sewing curtains and tablecloths on her ancient Singer machine, and neighbors stopping by to offer assistance or advice or just encouragement that kept Maya going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her determination. The menu was designed around the recipes that had made Maya's catering business successful: classic Southern comfort food, elevated slightly with fresh ingredients and careful technique, but still recognizable and welcoming to the community she was serving. There would be fried chicken brined in buttermilk and seasoned with a secret blend of spices that Maya's grandmother had passed down, collard greens cooked low and slow with smoked turkey and a touch of apple cider vinegar for brightness, macaroni and cheese made with 3 different cheeses and baked until the top formed a golden crust, cornbread with honey butter that melted into every crevice, and sweet potato pie that made people close their eyes and sigh with contentment. The restaurant opened on a Saturday in May, with a line that stretched down the block before the doors even opened at 11 in the morning. People from the neighborhood and members of Greater Mount Zion and customers from Maya's catering business, and even a few food bloggers who had heard about the project through social media. Maya had named the restaurant Soul and Grace after her grandmother Grace, who had taught her to cook, and who had always insisted that food wasn't just about feeding bodies, but about nourishing souls and building community. The opening day was chaotic and terrifying and absolutely perfect, with Maya cooking and managing the kitchen, while her mother worked the register and her father bussed tables, and Jasmine handed out menus with a pride that made customers smile and take pictures. They served 240 meals that day, far more than Maya had projected for an opening weekend, and by the time they locked the doors at 9 that evening, everyone was exhausted. But the cash register held more money than Maya had seen in one place in her entire life. The first 6 months were a blur of 18-hour days and constant problem-solving, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made Maya occasionally wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. But the restaurant survived and then began to thrive in ways that exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Soul and Grace became a gathering place for the neighborhood exactly as she had envisioned, somewhere families came for Sunday dinner after church services at Greater Mount Zion or Ebenezer Baptist or Holy Spirit Cathedral, somewhere business people met for lunch meetings, somewhere teenagers came after school for sweet tea and cornbread while doing homework in the corner booths that Maya had designated as study spaces. She hired staff from the neighborhood, giving first jobs to young people who needed work experience and second chances to people who had made mistakes but deserved opportunities to rebuild their lives, and she paid above minimum wage because she remembered what it was like to struggle on poverty wages and refuse to build her success on someone else's exploitation. The restaurant got reviewed by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and featured on local television news segments about neighborhood revitalization and mentioned in food blogs that celebrated authentic Southern cuisine. And each piece of recognition brought more customers and more revenue and more proof that James Whitmore had been catastrophically wrong in his assessment of her potential. But Maya never forgot the rejection or the humiliation or the way James Whitmore's eyes had dismissed her before she even finished presenting her case, and every night after closing, she would sit in the empty restaurant with a cup of coffee and the financial books that Eleanor had given her, teaching herself about banking and investment and corporate finance with the same determination she had brought to learning restaurant management. She studied how banks made money and evaluated risk and structured loans. She learned about commercial real estate and business valuations and the metrics that investors use to assess opportunities. She took online courses from Harvard Business School and Wharton through platforms like Coursera and EDX, staying up until 2 in the morning reading about leveraged buyouts and debt-to-equity ratios and the regulatory frameworks that governed financial institutions. Her friends thought she was crazy, asking why a successful restaurant owner needed to understand high finance. But Maya knew something they didn't, knew that she was preparing for a battle she couldn't yet fully articulate, but felt in her bones with the same certainty she felt about perfect seasoning ratios and baking temperatures. 1 year after opening Soul and Grace, Maya sat down with Eleanor Washington and proposed something that made even the older woman's eyebrows rise in surprise. She wanted to expand the restaurant to 3 locations, but more importantly, she wanted to start an investment group focused on supporting Black-owned businesses that traditional banks wouldn't fund, essentially creating the kind of institution that would have supported her when James Whitmore turned her away. Eleanor listened to Maya's proposal with increasing interest, asking questions about capital requirements and legal structure and how Maya planned to identify promising businesses versus risky ventures. And by the end of the conversation, she had agreed to be an anchor investor and to introduce Maya to other successful Black business owners in Atlanta who might be interested in joining the effort. Over the next 6 months, Maya assembled a network of 23 investors who each contributed between $5,000 and $50,000, creating a pool of $430,000 that could be used to fund small businesses through loans and equity investments, and she named the group Heritage Capital Partners as a reminder that they were building on the legacy of all the Black entrepreneurs who had created success despite every obstacle. The investment group's first loan went to a young Black man named Marcus Chen, who wanted to open a tech repair shop in the West End, and their second went to a Latina woman named Lisa Martinez, who needed capital to expand her legal practice focused on immigration and family law, and their third went to an older Black woman who wanted to convert her successful food truck into a brick-and-mortar Caribbean restaurant. Each loan came with mentorship and support and connection to other businesses in the network, creating an ecosystem of mutual aid that strengthened everyone involved, and Maya found herself energized by this work in ways that even the restaurant hadn't provided. She was building something bigger than her own success, creating pathways for other people who faced the same barriers she had faced, proving that communities could fund themselves when traditional institutions failed them. Heritage Capital Partners got mentioned in Black Enterprise magazine and featured at a conference for minority business owners and noticed by larger venture capital firms who were starting to pay attention to underserved markets. And Maya began meeting with people who had millions of dollars to invest and were looking for opportunities that combined social impact with financial returns. It was during one of these meetings that Maya first heard rumors about First Continental Bank struggling with bad investments and declining performance, something about commercial real estate loans that had gone south, and a portfolio of small business loans with default rates much higher than industry standards. She didn't think much about it initially, too focused on managing her own growing enterprises to pay attention to the problems of an institution that had rejected her, but the information lodged in her brain like a seed waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Maya's second and third Soul and Grace locations opened within 6 months of each other. one in the old Fourth Ward and one in East Point, both following the same model of combining excellent food with community space, and both succeeding beyond projections. She was employing 43 people now across the 3 restaurants and the investment group, generating annual revenues that approached $2 million, and she had paid off all her loans and owned her businesses free and clear. Her credit score was now 807, her bank accounts held substantial reserves, and her reputation in Atlanta's business community had grown to the point where people sought her advice rather than questioning her credentials. The newspapers reported that First Continental Bank was seeking new investors after several quarters of declining profits and shareholder concerns about management decisions. And Maya read these reports with interest that slowly transformed into something that felt like destiny calling. She remembered James Whitmore's office with its golf trophies and its assumption of permanence, remembered his dismissive tone and his suggestion that she try a smaller institution, remembered the way he had made her feel small and unworthy and limited by factors she couldn't control. Now she understood banking well enough to read First Continental's publicly available financial statements and see the full extent of their problems, could analyze their loan portfolio and identify the decisions that had led to their current crisis, could calculate what it would cost to acquire a controlling stake in the institution if she assembled the right coalition of investors. The idea was audacious and probably crazy, and exactly the kind of thing that Eleanor Washington would appreciate, and Maya sat with it for several weeks before speaking it aloud, letting it grow from fantasy into possibility into something that might actually be achievable with enough planning and support and determination. Maya walked into Eleanor Washington's sunroom on a Tuesday morning in late September, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 53 pages of financial analysis, market research, and strategic planning that had consumed every spare moment of the past 6 weeks. And before she even sat down, she announced that she wanted to buy First Continental Bank. Eleanor, who had been watering her orchids with the careful attention she gave to everything in her life, set down the watering can and turned to look at Maya with an expression that combined surprise and admiration and the kind of fierce pride that grandmothers reserve for grandchildren who exceed every expectation. The older woman gestured for Maya to sit and poured coffee from a silver service that had belonged to her own grandmother, who had been enslaved in South Carolina before emancipation, and she listened without interrupting while Maya laid out her plan with the same meticulous detail she had once used to present her restaurant concept to the banker who had rejected her. The bank was vulnerable in ways that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers, Maya explained, with a commercial loan portfolio that had deteriorated significantly over the past 18 months, and a management team that had made decisions prioritizing short-term profits over long-term sustainability, and the shareholders were increasingly restless about declining dividends and falling stock prices that had erased 30% of the bank's market value since its peak 3 years earlier. Eleanor asked the hard questions that Maya had anticipated, questions about where the capital would come from and whether Maya had the expertise to run a financial institution, and what would happen to the restaurant businesses if this acquisition failed spectacularly. Maya answered each question with documentation and projections and contingency plans, explaining that she had already spoken with 3 venture capital firms that specialized in community development financial institutions and had preliminary commitments for $20 million in institutional investment if she could demonstrate community support and a viable turnaround strategy. She talked about her plan to transform First Continental from a traditional commercial bank that served primarily corporate clients into a community development institution that focused on small businesses and minority entrepreneurs who were underserved by larger banks, essentially scaling up the model she had proven with Heritage Capital Partners. Eleanor listened and asked more questions, and finally leaned back in her chair with a smile that suggested she had been waiting for Maya to propose something exactly this audacious. And she said that she would invest $1 million personally and help Maya connect with other wealthy black investors in Atlanta who might be interested in being part of something that would reshape the city's financial landscape and prove that community-based banking could be both profitable and socially transformative. The next 3 months were a whirlwind of meetings and presentations and negotiations that tested every skill Maya had developed over the past 2 years of intensive self-education in finance and business strategy. She met with pastors at megachurches like Greater Mount Zion and Ebenezer Baptist and New Birth Missionary Baptist, explaining her vision and asking them to encourage their congregations to invest whatever they could afford, even if it was just $500, because this was about collective ownership and community power rather than individual wealth accumulation. She presented to the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP and the Urban League and the National Council of Negro Women, organizations that had fought for economic justice for decades and immediately understood the symbolic and practical importance of a black woman acquiring a bank that had historically excluded people who looked like her. She met with venture capitalists in gleaming offices in Midtown and Buckhead, learning to speak their language about internal rates of return and exit strategies, while also making them understand that this investment was about more than financial returns. It was about creating a model that could be replicated in cities across the country, where minority communities lacked access to capital and banking services that understood their needs and circumstances. Maya's reputation in Atlanta's business community helped open doors that would have remained closed to someone less established, but she still faced skepticism from investors who questioned whether a restaurant owner could successfully manage a bank and whether the acquisition price was justified given First Continental's declining performance. She brought in consultants who had experience with bank turnarounds, assembled an advisory board that included former bank executives and community development experts, and developed a detailed 100-day plan for what she would do immediately after acquiring control to stabilize operations and begin implementing her vision. The plan included replacing senior management with people who understood community banking, restructuring the loan portfolio to reduce exposure to risky commercial real estate while increasing small business lending, opening branches in underserved neighborhoods like Mechanicsville and West End and East Point, and creating specialized lending programs for minority-owned businesses that traditional underwriting criteria systematically excluded. Every presentation ended with Maya telling her own story of being rejected by James Whitmore, not because she was unqualified, but because he couldn't see past his assumptions about who deserved access to capital. And that story resonated with every black person in every room, because they all had their own versions of being dismissed or diminished or denied opportunities they had clearly earned. The fundraising campaign went viral on social media in ways Maya hadn't anticipated, with Black Twitter and Instagram amplifying the message that a black woman was trying to buy the bank that had rejected her and turn it into an institution that would serve communities that traditional banks ignored. People who had never invested in anything started opening accounts at Community First Credit Union to participate in the investment opportunity. Churches took up special offerings to contribute to the acquisition fund, and black celebrities and athletes from Atlanta started reaching out to Eleanor Washington, asking how they could be part of this historic moment. Maya appeared on local television shows and was profiled in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and got interviewed by Black Enterprise and Essence magazine, and each piece of media attention brought more investors and more money and more momentum to a campaign that had taken on significance far beyond the financial transaction itself. This was about rewriting the narrative of who controlled capital and who decided which dreams deserved funding, about proving that communities could build their own institutions when existing institutions failed them, about a woman who'd been told she wasn't good enough coming back to buy the very place that had rejected her, and transforming it into something that reflected her values, rather than perpetuating the exclusions that had kept people like her locked out of opportunity. By December, Maya had commitments for $55 million, far more than the $35 million she had initially projected she would need for a controlling stake in First Continental Bank. And the excess capital meant she could not only acquire the bank, but also invest in the infrastructure and staffing and technology needed to implement her transformation plan immediately, rather than phasing it in over several years. She worked with lawyers at Martinez and Associates, the firm she had helped fund through Heritage Capital Partners, to structure the acquisition as a combination of equity investment and debt financing that would allow her to maintain control while sharing ownership with the community of investors who had made this possible. The legal documents were complex and technical and filled with language about voting rights and governance structures and fiduciary responsibilities. But the essential truth was simple and revolutionary. A black woman who had been rejected for an $85,000 loan was now preparing to acquire a financial institution with assets of $200 million and the power to approve or deny loans that would shape the futures of thousands of people. The formal offer went to First Continental's board of directors in early January, and Maya insisted on presenting it personally rather than letting lawyers handle everything, wanting the board members to see her face and hear her voice and understand that this wasn't a hostile takeover but an opportunity to salvage something valuable from their mismanagement. The boardroom was on the 20th floor of the same building where James Whitmore had rejected her loan application 2 years earlier, and Maya felt a strange sense of symmetry walking through those doors again. No longer a supplicant asking for help, but a buyer offering to rescue an institution that had lost its way. The board members were almost all white men over 50, exactly the demographic Maya had expected, and their faces showed varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity, and barely concealed discomfort at the situation they found themselves in. Forced to consider selling their bank to someone they would have dismissed as irrelevant just a few years earlier. Maya presented her offer with the same meticulous preparation she brought to everything, walking them through her analysis of the bank's problems and her strategic plan for fixing those problems and the community support she had assembled to make this acquisition possible, and she watched their expressions shift from skepticism to grudging respect as they realized she understood their business better than they expected and possibly better than they understood it themselves. If you're inspired by this story of determination and justice, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss powerful stories like this. Comment below with "Never give up on your dreams" to share your thoughts on Maya's incredible journey and encourage others who face discrimination. The questions from board members revealed their concerns about whether Maya could actually execute the turnaround plan and whether the community investment model was sustainable or just idealistic fantasy, and she answered each concern with data and case studies and references to successful community development banks like Shore Bank in Chicago and Self-Help Credit Union in North Carolina that had proven the viability of mission-driven banking. One board member asked directly whether this acquisition was about revenge against the bank that had rejected her loan application, and Maya paused before answering because she wanted to be truthful rather than diplomatic. She said that yes, being rejected had been part of her motivation to understand banking and finance, that James Whitmore's dismissal had lit a fire that had driven her to prove him wrong, but that her vision for First Continental was about much more than personal vindication. This was about creating an institution that served communities rather than extracting wealth from them, about proving that banks could be profitable while also being socially responsible, about demonstrating that people who traditional underwriting excluded weren't actually high risks, but rather opportunities that required different evaluation criteria and support structures. The board member nodded slowly and said that was a good answer. And Maya could see that she had earned something valuable in that moment. Not approval exactly, but recognition that she was serious and capable and not someone they could easily dismiss. The vote came 3 weeks later, after the board had reviewed her financials and checked her references and consulted with their own advisors about whether this acquisition made sense for shareholders who had seen their investment decline significantly over the past 2 years. Maya was at Soul and Grace in the old Fourth Ward when Eleanor called with the news that the board had voted to accept her offer, and she sat down hard in one of the dining room chairs because her legs suddenly couldn't support her weight, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just accomplished and what it meant for her and her daughter and everyone who had invested in this vision. Eleanor's voice on the phone was thick with emotion as she said that Maya had done something extraordinary, something that would be remembered in Atlanta's history as a turning point, and that her grandmother Grace would have been so proud of the woman Maya had become. They scheduled the formal announcement for the following week, giving Maya time to prepare her statement and notify all the investors who had made this possible and steel herself for the media attention that would inevitably follow. And she spent those days in a strange state of suspended disbelief, unable to fully process that she was about to become the owner and CEO of a bank with 9 branches and 200 employees and the power to reshape financial access for thousands of families. The announcement made national news, covered by CNN and MSNBC and featured in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, all of them telling the story of the black woman who had been rejected for a small business loan and came back 2 years later to buy the entire bank. Maya did interviews where journalists asked her about discrimination and perseverance and what advice she had for other minority entrepreneurs facing similar barriers. And she tried to balance honesty about the obstacles with optimism about possibilities. Not wanting to discourage people, but also not wanting to pretend that success came easily, or that the system was fair to everyone who worked hard and followed the rules. She talked about the importance of community support and self-education, and finding mentors like Eleanor Washington who could open doors and share wisdom. And she emphasized that her success wasn't just individual achievement, but collective victory, made possible by thousands of people who invested what they could and believed in a vision of banking that served communities rather than exploiting them. The story resonated far beyond Atlanta, inspiring similar efforts in cities like Detroit and Philadelphia and Oakland, where minority communities were organizing to acquire local banks or credit unions and transform them into community development institutions. The transition period was carefully structured to maintain stability while beginning implementation of Maya's transformation plan, with her officially taking control in March and immediately installing new management in key positions, while keeping experienced staff who understood operations and could ensure continuity during the changeover. One of her first decisions was about what to do with James Whitmore, who was still working in the commercial lending department and who had surely heard the news about who had acquired the bank and must have been dreading the moment when he would have to face the woman he had rejected. Maya could have fired him immediately with cause or without cause, could have made him suffer the way she had suffered, sitting in that parking garage 2 years earlier, could have extracted revenge in ways that would have felt satisfying in the short term, but ultimately diminished her vision for what this institution could become. Instead, she scheduled a private meeting with Whitmore in what was now her office, the same corner office where he had told her that her credit wasn't strong enough and her business plan was too risky, and maybe she should try a smaller institution that specialized in higher-risk loans. Whitmore walked into that office looking like a man facing execution, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he sat in the same chair where Maya had sat 2 years earlier, and the role reversal was so perfect that Maya had to resist the urge to savor it, because this moment wasn't about her satisfaction, but about what kind of leader she wanted to be, and what kind of institution she wanted to build. She pulled out her original loan application from a drawer where she had kept it all this time, the pages now worn from being handled during moments when she needed to remember why she was working so hard and what she was fighting for, and she placed it on the desk between them exactly as Whitmore had placed documents between them during that first meeting. She asked him if he remembered this application and this meeting, and Whitmore nodded without speaking, his eyes unable to meet hers, and Maya could see that he understood exactly what was happening and was waiting for the punishment he knew he deserved. She told him that she remembered everything about that meeting, every dismissive gesture and condescending word and assumption about who she was and what she was capable of achieving, and she asked him if he understood now that his rejection had been based not on her qualifications, but on his biases and limitations. Whitmore sat across from Maya in what had once been his colleague's office and was now her domain, his face showing the kind of shame that only comes from being forced to confront the consequences of your own prejudices and limitations. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper as he admitted that yes, he had let his assumptions cloud his judgment, and that he had denied her loan, not because her application was weak, but because he couldn't see past his own biases about who belonged in business and who deserved access to capital. Maya listened to his confession without interrupting, watching this man who had once held power over her future, now reduced to begging for mercy, or at least understanding. And she felt something unexpected rise up inside her. Not the satisfaction of revenge she had sometimes imagined during the long nights of studying finance and building her businesses, but rather a kind of weary recognition that James Whitmore was as much a victim of the system as she was, taught from childhood to see the world in hierarchies and categories that determined who deserved opportunities and who should be grateful for whatever scraps they received. She told him that she could fire him right now and everyone would understand, and probably applaud the poetic justice of it. The woman he rejected coming back to eliminate him from the institution he had represented. But that wasn't why she had bought this bank, and that wasn't the kind of leader she intended to be, or the kind of institution she wanted to build from the ashes of First Continental's failures. Maya explained that she was transforming the bank into an institution that actually served communities rather than extracting wealth from them, that she was implementing lending programs specifically designed to fund businesses that traditional underwriting systematically excluded, that she was opening branches in neighborhoods like Mechanicsville and West End, where banks had been closing branches for decades because poor people weren't profitable enough to justify the overhead costs. She told Whitmore that he had a choice to make. He could leave with a generous severance package and go work somewhere else where he could continue making the same mistakes and perpetuating the same exclusions. Or he could stay and learn a different way of banking, could work in the community outreach department, helping minority entrepreneurs navigate the loan application process and understand the financial education they needed to build sustainable businesses. The position would be a demotion from his current role and would pay less than he was making now, and would require him to spend time in neighborhoods he had probably avoided his entire life. But it would also give him a chance to be part of something meaningful, rather than just another cog in a machine that perpetuated inequality while pretending to offer equal opportunity. Whitmore looked at her with something like wonder, clearly not having expected grace or second chances, and he asked why she would offer him this opportunity when she had every right to punish him for what he had done. And Maya's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. She said that punishing him wouldn't change anything about the system that had taught him to think the way he thought. but showing him a different way of operating might change how he saw the world and who he became. Going forward, the transformation of First Continental Bank into what Maya renamed Community First Financial Institution happened over 6 months that tested every leadership skill she had developed and required her to work 18-hour days again, just like during the early months of Soul and Grace. But this time, she had a team and resources and a clear vision that guided every decision and policy change. She brought in Reverend Jonathan Williams from Greater Mount Zion to head the community advisory board that would ensure the bank stayed accountable to the neighborhoods it served. And she hired Sandra Mitchell, away from Community First Credit Union, to run the small business lending department because Sandra understood how to evaluate businesses that didn't fit traditional underwriting criteria, and how to provide the support and mentorship that made the difference between a loan that succeeded and one that failed. Maya kept most of the existing staff because they knew operations and customer relationships and the technical aspects of banking, but she required everyone to go through training on implicit bias and cultural competency and the history of discriminatory lending practices, so they understood why the old way of doing business had failed so many people and what the new approach was trying to accomplish. Some employees quit rather than adapt to the new culture, but most stayed, and many of them privately admitted that they had always been uncomfortable with some of the bank's practices, but hadn't felt empowered to challenge decisions made by senior management, who cared more about quarterly profits than long-term community relationships. The first loans approved under Maya's leadership went to businesses remarkably similar to her own restaurant concept 2 years earlier. Small ventures with solid business plans and community support, but credit histories or collateral situations that didn't fit traditional banking models. There was a young Latina woman who wanted to open a bakery specializing in quinceañera cakes and needed $30,000 for equipment and initial inventory. And there was a middle-aged black man who had been laid off from his job at Delta Airlines and wanted to start a lawn care business serving commercial properties, but needed a truck and equipment and working capital to get started. Each loan came with financial counseling and mentorship connections, and ongoing support from the bank's community outreach team that now included James Whitmore, who had accepted Maya's offer and was slowly learning to see potential where he had been trained to see only risk. Maya made a point of attending loan approval meetings and sometimes delivering the good news personally to borrowers who had been rejected elsewhere, wanting them to understand that Community First Financial was different and that their success mattered not just to them, but to the institution and the broader community that had invested in this vision of what banking could be. The media attention continued for months after the acquisition, with journalists writing follow-up stories about how the transformation was going and whether the community banking model was sustainable or just idealistic fantasy that would collapse under economic pressure. Maya welcomed the scrutiny because she knew that success needed to be visible and documented if other communities were going to be inspired to attempt similar transformations. And she made sure that quarterly reports were publicly available and showed both the social impact metrics like number of minority businesses funded and the financial performance metrics like return on assets and loan default rates. The data told a compelling story. Community First Financial was not only fulfilling its mission of serving underserved communities, but was also more profitable than First Continental had been in its final years under the old management, proving that community-focused banking and financial sustainability weren't contradictory goals, but actually complementary when executed properly. The success attracted attention from foundations and impact investors who provided additional capital for expansion, and within a year of the acquisition, Maya was opening new branches in College Park and Decatur and planning expansion into other Georgia cities like Macon and Savannah and Augusta, where minority communities faced similar barriers to capital access. Soul and Grace expanded along with the bank, with Maya opening her fourth and fifth restaurant locations and developing a catering division that served corporate events and weddings and large gatherings. But she was careful to maintain the community feel that had made the original location successful rather than pursuing growth just for the sake of scaling up. She promoted managers from within, rather than hiring experienced restaurant people from outside, creating pathways for employees who had started as dishwashers or servers to eventually run their own locations. And she implemented profit-sharing programs so that everyone who worked at Soul and Grace benefited from the company's success rather than just enriching the owner. The restaurants became case studies in the business classes Maya now taught occasionally at Spelman College and Morehouse College, examples of how businesses could be both profitable and socially responsible, how success didn't require exploitation, how the false choice between doing good and doing well was actually just an excuse for people who didn't want to think creatively about building sustainable models that served multiple stakeholders rather than just maximizing shareholder returns. Eleanor Washington's health began declining that summer, the arthritis that had gnarled her fingers spreading to other joints and making movement painful and difficult, but her mind remained sharp and her interest in Maya's projects never wavered. Maya visited the Buckhead House every Sunday afternoon after church services at Greater Mount Zion, bringing soul food from the restaurant and sitting in the sunroom where so many crucial conversations had happened. And they would talk for hours about business strategy and community development and the deeper questions about what success meant and how to measure a life well lived. Eleanor told stories Maya had never heard before, stories about the civil rights movement in Atlanta and the lunch counter sit-ins and the economic boycotts that had forced downtown businesses to integrate. Stories about how social change happened through both confrontation and construction, both protest and building alternative institutions that demonstrated different possibilities. She talked about how Maya's acquisition of the bank was part of a long tradition of black economic self-determination that stretched back through the Freedmen's Bank after the Civil War and the Black Wall Street in Tulsa before the massacre, and the countless mutual aid societies and credit unions and cooperative businesses that black communities had built when white institutions excluded them. And she said that Maya was carrying forward that legacy in ways that would inspire the next generation to keep building and fighting and refusing to accept limitations that others tried to impose. Jasmine was 10 years old now and growing into a young woman who understood more about her mother's journey than Maya had realized, asking questions about discrimination and persistence and what it meant to fight for justice, while also showing grace to people who had treated you unjustly. Maya tried to give honest answers that acknowledged the complexity without overwhelming her daughter with the weight of history and ongoing struggles, explaining that anger was a natural response to injustice, but that anger alone didn't build anything sustainable. That real change required combining righteous fury with strategic thinking and long-term vision and willingness to do the hard work of construction rather than just destruction. They visited Eleanor together that fall when the older woman's health took a turn for the worse, and Jasmine sat by Eleanor's bedside reading aloud from books about black history and women entrepreneurs, while Maya held her mentor's hand and fought back tears. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in October with Maya and Jasmine, and dozens of other people she had mentored and supported over the decades gathered in her bedroom. And her funeral at Greater Mount Zion drew over 1,000 people who had been touched by her generosity and wisdom and unwavering commitment to building black economic power in Atlanta and beyond. Maya gave the eulogy at Eleanor's funeral, speaking about how this woman had transformed her life, not just through financial investment, but through teaching her to think bigger and fight smarter, and never accept that discrimination and exclusion were permanent features of the landscape rather than obstacles that could be overcome through intelligence and persistence and community solidarity. She talked about the afternoon when Eleanor had challenged her to decide what she would do with the anger from being rejected by James Whitmore. How that conversation had set her on a path that led to acquiring a bank and transforming it into an institution that honored Eleanor's legacy of building rather than just protesting. The funeral program included a photograph of Eleanor from the 1970s standing in front of her first beauty salon with an expression of fierce determination that reminded Maya of her own face in the mirror on the morning she had gone to meet with the banker who would reject her loan and inadvertently set in motion everything that followed. After the funeral, Maya established the Eleanor Washington Foundation, using a portion of the profits from Soul and Grace and Community First Financial, creating a perpetual fund that would provide grants and loans to Black women entrepreneurs in Atlanta and eventually across the South, ensuring that Eleanor's impact would continue long after her death and that future generations would benefit from the same kind of mentorship and support that had made Maya's success possible. The confrontation with James Whitmore that Maya had imagined so many times during the difficult months of building her businesses and studying finance turned out to be not a moment of triumph or revenge, but rather something more complicated and ultimately more meaningful, a conversion rather than a victory. Whitmore had accepted the demotion and pay cut and reassignment to community outreach, and over the months following the acquisition, Maya watched him slowly transform from someone who saw certain people as risks to be managed into someone who saw potential and possibility in entrepreneurs who didn't fit traditional molds. He worked directly with loan applicants now, helping them understand what documentation they needed and how to present their businesses in ways that highlighted strengths rather than exposing weaknesses. And he brought a technical knowledge of banking that complemented Sandra Mitchell's intuitive understanding of community needs. Maya observed him one afternoon, working with a young Black man who wanted to open an auto repair shop and was struggling to articulate his business plan in language that bankers would understand. And she saw Whitmore patiently walking him through the process with genuine investment in his success, rather than looking for reasons to deny the application. And she realized that Grace had accomplished something that punishment never could have achieved. The bank's success attracted attention from larger financial institutions who wanted to acquire Community First Financial and incorporate its community banking model into their own operations. And Maya received offers that would have made her extraordinarily wealthy, while allowing her to step back from the daily grind of running a financial institution and focus entirely on her restaurants and her family. She seriously considered these offers, discussing them with her advisory board and her remaining family and the community leaders who had invested in her vision, but ultimately she declined because selling would have meant giving up control over the mission and culture she had worked so hard to build. And she didn't trust that acquiring banks would maintain the commitment to community development once the social impact metrics stopped generating positive press coverage. Instead, Maya began working with other communities in cities like Birmingham and Memphis and Charlotte who wanted to replicate the Community First financial model in their own contexts, providing consulting and advice and connections to impact investors who were interested in funding similar transformations. And slowly, a network emerged of community development banks, led primarily by women and people of color who had been excluded from traditional finance, but understood their communities in ways that traditional bankers never would. Maya stood in what had once been James Whitmore's office 5 years after buying the bank, looking out floor-to-ceiling windows at the Atlanta skyline that seemed to sparkle with possibility in the afternoon sun. And she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from that parking garage where she had cried after being rejected to this position of influence and power and responsibility. On the wall behind her desk hung the framed rejection letter from First Continental Bank, the document that Jasmine had asked about and that Maya kept as a reminder of where she had started and what she had overcome. And next to it hung a photograph of Eleanor Washington standing in front of her first beauty salon, with that expression of determination that had inspired generations of black women to keep fighting and building despite every obstacle. The bank was now serving over 3,000 small businesses across Georgia, had funded over $500 million in loans to minority entrepreneurs, and was profitable enough to provide returns to the community investors who had made the acquisition possible while also reinvesting in expanded services and new branches in underserved areas. Soul + Grace had grown to 12 locations and was being featured in national food magazines and attracting customers from across the Southeast who wanted to experience authentic Southern cuisine in settings that felt like family rather than just restaurants. And Maya was in conversations with publishers about writing a book that would tell her story and hopefully inspire other people facing discrimination to channel their anger into building rather than just protesting. Jasmine was 15 now and talking about wanting to study business and finance in college so she could eventually join her mother's enterprises and help expand the community banking model to other cities and states. And Maya felt both pride and concern about her daughter choosing a path that would inevitably involve struggle and discrimination, and the constant work of proving herself to people who would question her capabilities based on her race and gender. But she also knew that Jasmine had grown up watching her mother transform rejection into triumph, and had absorbed lessons about persistence and vision and grace that would serve her well regardless of what challenges she faced. And Maya trusted that the next generation would build on what she and Eleanor and countless other black women had constructed, despite every barrier and limitation that systems designed by other people had tried to impose. The story that had begun with humiliation in a banker's office had become something larger and more meaningful than personal vindication, had become about creating institutions and opportunities and pathways that would outlive her and serve communities for generations. And Maya understood finally that this was what Eleanor had meant when she talked about building tables rather than begging for seats, about creating power rather than asking permission, about transforming pain into purpose and rage into redemption that blessed everyone it touched.